Good morning. Happy Tuesday, and welcome to Tuesday Tea-ology. Hope your day is going good. It's uh it's one of the last moderately warm days today, and we're going to slip into a little bit of a chilly spell, but that's what hot tea is for, right? Mm. And whether you have the tea or you don't, the theology is the heart of the teology. I hope your week is starting well. And we have been talking about the doctrine of creation, grounded in the doctrine of God, and embracing, including the doctrine of mankind. And we've been following the biblical account of creation because, of course, the Genesis 1 and 2 is our primary point of data about the creation, though there is testimony about it and elsewhere in the scriptures. And the there is a parallel here. Genesis 1 and 2 provide us with two complementary creation accounts. So in some ways, it's wrong to say two creation accounts because we're not getting different stories in terms of opposing stories. But what we're getting is one. Genesis 1 gives a big cosmic level account, and then Genesis 2 focuses in particularly with special attention to mankind and the relations of man to his environment, to the animals, and so on. So there is no tension between these accounts. They are complementary, much like the four gospel accounts that we have in the New Testament. And so after the description of the creation week, then Genesis 2 comes along and it focuses in on the environment that God has created for his human creatures. And so there's this parallel to observe between Genesis 1 and 2 that both of them work from a big picture of God creating a dwelling place, and then they close in to that climax of creation, the creation of mankind made in the image of God. And Genesis 1 worked from cosmically big picture down to man made in the image of God, made male and female in the image of God, given dominion over the world and tasked to be fruitful and multiply and so on. And so the image of God spelled out in its dimensions as the human constitution, what we are, but then working out in our dominion over the world and in our relationships as well. And then Genesis 2 comes along and it just has a closer view. So it doesn't start with a cosmic creation, but it focuses first on God creating this lush garden for mankind, the Garden of Eden, which has come to have such a big place, not only, of course, in the biblical story and whatnot, but even in the broader cultural imagination as people reflect upon this original paradise, which, of course, many people, of course, would think of it as myth, but whether they understand it to be real or even if they don't, nonetheless, it has influenced and had this cultural effect. But that is, in fact, how things began. God created this ideal environment for his creatures, particularly for the first man and woman, and ostensibly for their descendants if there had been no fall. And so there is this wonderful paradise garden that is made for them in God's good world. And in the middle of the garden are these two trees, the tree of life, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that creates a choice, an opportunity of whether to pursue the way that leads to life or whether to turn aside, because the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is forbidden by the command of God. And God is very explicit and strenuous in this command. You must not eat of it, and on the day you eat of it, you will surely die. And that, of course, then sets up the story of the fall. But the tree of life is there as well. And we may look at that and see the setup for the larger biblical theme about choosing the way of life or the way that leads to death. You see that in the wisdom literature, choosing between the two ways. And of course, that comes to its high point in the gospel opportunity to choose the way of Christ and the way of following him, the way that leads to life, or to reject him and choose the way that leads to death. But that's all part of the setup and the scenario that God has made. There are these rivers flowing through this well-watered region, and here the first man, Adam, is put to work the ground and to keep it. We're in Genesis chapter 2:15, and then there comes this time where God says it is not good. Genesis 2:18. And that's the first not good in the Bible. God has created this good creation, but it is not good that the man should be alone. So evil has not come into the world yet. So we wouldn't say it is evil, but there is an incompleteness to man alone. And so a companion is sought, and the whole animal world fails. Yes, even the dog, man's best friend, fails to satisfy. Instead, God then proceeds to create out of the side of the man a woman, and to then bring them together. And so there is this complementary nature of man and woman. So now we're elaborating on what Genesis 1 said. So you see how the doctrine of mankind is tied in with the doctrine of creation, and we're elaborating on it. Genesis 1 identified that the distinction of man and woman, male and female, while this is shared by much of the animal kingdom, it has a greater significance in the case of mankind, and that this is a fundamental distinction in the human race. There's all kinds of other distinctions that arise, whether out of biology and geography and so on, or whether just out of social construction, distinctions of race and class and nationality and so on. And these distinctions are real to the extent that they have real effects, and they have historically had real results, sometimes extremely tragic results, as in the case of racism, but they are not fundamental to the nature of humanity. The distinction that is fundamental to humanity is the distinction between man and woman, not a uh, not a distinction of one being more important or more in the image of God than the other. No, equally made in the image of God, equal in value and importance and significance as God's creatures, but different, fundamentally distinct. Well, that is elaborated in Genesis 2, where we see that this distinction is a complementary distinction. It is not meant to be a distinction of opposition. It is meant to be a complementary distinction. The woman is made from the man, and there is a normative union of the man and woman. And so we have in Genesis 2 a particular explanation of the significance and the symbolism and so on of human sexuality. That man and woman have this unity, but then distinction, and human sexuality is exemplifies the unifying relation between man and woman. So when God creates the woman and brings her to the man, then the man said, this is Genesis 2:23, then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." Okay, this is not like the animals that is different from me. That this is different, but of me, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. So the great connection and distinction tied together. And then verse 24, therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So that one flesh relationship, the sexual expression of man and woman, just as the difference, the biological sexual distinction of man and woman is more significant in humanity than in the animal kingdom, so human sexuality has a significance beyond the animal kingdom. In the animal kingdom, it is fundamentally procreative. And certainly in humanity, that's very important, procreative. God tells us to flourish and multiply. But the most fundamental element of human sexuality is that it is unitive, the uniting of the complementary to distinct distinctions of humanity. And that tells us what is so fundamentally wrong with homosexuality, is that it cannot fulfill this unitive function that is the basic the basic ultimate meaning of human sexuality, and which has a parabolic significance. You take this into the New Testament, and the apostle talks about marriage as an image of Christ and the church. That we could say something to the effect that this union is a parable of the soul's longing for God. I don't know whether I'm quoting someone or not. It's in my mind here, but this idea that it is significant. It represents our need for our Maker as well. That it reaches beyond it. But in the basic level, it has this unity in distinction, in which we echo our Creator, our three in one God, who has unity and distinction in his own triune life. So don't push this into some areas of mysticism and whatnot beyond what we're getting to, but we are talking about the significance of human sexuality as deep roots in the origins and creation design of humanity, and shows where some of the twistings of our own culture are astray. That this notion of transgenderism is a defiance of the doctrine of creation in Genesis 1, and the notion of homosexuality is defiance of the doctrine of creation as expressed in Genesis 2. That God has his design, and when we defy it, there will be sorrow. And it's easy to see why these things are twistings of God's design when you understand the fundamental doctrine of creation, the doctrine of mankind. So this, but this distinction, we we have to take a negative because people try to attack God's design, but at the same time, we want to turn around and keep our eye on the positive. That the doctrine of mankind, and especially as concerns human sexuality, is not meant to just be a list of don'ts. It is a recognition of God's glorious design. This is good. God has made us wonderfully, man and woman, and has designed, not always. God calls many people to single life, okay, not always, but normatively has designed for our being as man and woman to be lived out in a marriage covenant where this distinction and unity is celebrated. And that is good. And so rather than simply looking at a list of rules and saying, why has God set up all these boundaries over what we want to do? We should acknowledge the grandeur of what God has done and celebrate the beauty of God's design for us as his creatures made in his image, God's design for man and woman. And so when we come to the end of Genesis 2 and the fleshing out of this creation account, we see God's love for people profoundly displayed in his good design for us and in the good world he made, and that he made in this good world the good relationship of man and woman, and put us in a place for flourishing and life and joy between him, and where the opportunity was given to choose the way of life. But unfortunately, of course, the fall comes in and takes things down. The last statement in Genesis chapter 2 is, and the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And so there was an innocence at that time, a fundamental innocence. We can't just recapture that by you know protesting and saying, so all these clothes are just a construct and we're going to get rid of them. No, that innocence has been lost in the fall, but it is, again, setting up how God made things to be. God did not create a creation. God did not create mankind full of guilt and shame and whatnot. He created in innocence a good mankind, and he has good plans to restore his creation. He gave his son, sent his son to become one of us as a man and to bear the penalty for our sins, to rise to bring us life in his great work of restoring what has fallen away and drawing us to himself, to be adopted as his children, to be his people, to realize as the redeemed, belonging to Christ by the Holy Spirit, united with the Son by faith, to realize that longing for God, which He has put in our hearts. So, may God bless you as you go through your week, draw you close to Himself, give you wisdom and grace in all things. Bye bye.